These stories are equal parts stupid and disturbing. From a man inside a safe house with a homemade explosive device wired to a cheap prepaid phone, to a woman who prioritized fashion over safety as she flexed her designer scarf in an open convertible. I'm Tucker, and these are the most bizarre Darwin Award deaths ever. It was December 31st, 2015, on the eastern fringe of Cotabato City, Philippines, where the last hours of the year dissolved into firecracker smoke and the sound of children running in the alleys. Nobody on that street was paying close attention to anything that night, which is exactly the condition that tends to precede certain kinds of disasters. Ramil Jandayan was 32 years old and lived in the margins of other people's lives. Based on my research, there's really not much known about him and his family. However, neighbors described him as paranoid and unstable, quick to threaten people over imagined disrespect. A police report said that in the months before his death, he had been running errands for a low-level militant cell operating near the city. Apparently, he had been assigned to stay overnight in a rented safe house on the city's edge, minding a homemade explosive device he made scheduled for transport the following morning. Investigations suggested that the job was not his to manage beyond keeping it secure, and he was originally only meant to act as a basic overnight guard, while more experienced members handled the device. But after others left the location to move between sites during New Year's activity, he remained inside the structure. Against instructions, he later interfered with the assembly and wired a cheap prepaid cell phone into a crude triggering system, built around a simple improvised relay switch scavenged from low-voltage electronics rather than any stable firing unit. I think the people who gave him this assignment already knew exactly who they were dealing with. He must have kept the phone powered on beside the device. That day, the fireworks outside were constant, random detonations across the district, some close enough to rattle the shutters, the kind of noise that hides everything underneath it. And then the telecom provider's automated promotional message went out as part of a congested New Year's network-wide holiday broadcast. It reached his phone shortly after midnight. The incoming signal triggered the phone's vibration motor, which in turn activated the improvised relay circuit. Aljun Marohom, one of the militants arrested weeks later, said that he was sitting in a plastic chair in the unit next door, near the shared wall, when the flash came through. He later told investigators it wasn't fire exactly, just light and pressure arriving at the same instant, lifting him from the chair and depositing him on the floor. His windows blew outward into the alley in a single burst. The roof panels above him rose and dropped back down with a heavy, hollow metallic sound. He remained on the floor for several seconds before he understood what had happened. His ears rang for the rest of the night. Police and firefighters arrived roughly 10 to 15 minutes later, initially responding as though a fireworks stockpile had detonated. Ramil's body parts were found in the room's interior. Investigators recovered fragments of the shattered cell phone scattered across debris near the wall and embedded shallowly in broken plaster and wood fragments. The initial post-incident assessment described catastrophic blast trauma, severe fragmentation injuries to the torso and upper body, complete disruption of the chest cavity, consistent with a point-blank detonation. The more formal coroner documentation came later and clarified the extent of internal damage after examination. A brief police statement was released that night in general terms, with more technical conclusions added in subsequent reporting. Aljun was arrested several weeks later, reportedly describing the triggering setup in detail during questioning, and that account became the clearest available reconstruction of what happened inside that room. I don't feel sympathy for Ramil Jandayan, but I do think about whoever handed him that device and left the building. The neighborhood remembered it less as a terrorism incident than as the story of the man who killed himself with a holiday text promotion. And if you think nothing can top that stupidity, we're just getting started. The next one features a guy who decided that the way to settle a dispute was being drunk on horseback. It was August 14th, 2014, on a flat stretch of road east of Waco, Texas, where the summer heat stayed well past sundown, and a man who had spent years refining the art of the small grudge arrived at its largest possible outcome. Colter Wachowski was 41 years old and worked seasonal fencing contracts across McLennan County. For 3 years, he had converted a property line dispute with his neighbor, Wes Pritchard, into something approaching a full-time concern, filing county complaints, calling local inspectors over the smoke from Wes's backyard grill and measuring his fence posts with a tape measure he kept in his truck. At bars, he committed fully to the cowboy image. Wide-brimmed hat, boots, loud stories about the land and the principle of the thing. The stories worsened with each drink, and that night he had been drinking for close to 6 hours. The complaint was the one he always came back to. Wes had shifted a boundary marker by 6 inches, and nobody had done anything about it, and tonight was the night. His friends laughed. Coulter announced he was going to settle it like a real Texan, then walked to where his gelding, Boone, was being kept at a nearby rural rodeo grounds parking lot rather than a formal stable. I'll be honest, not one person standing in that gravel lot took him seriously enough to step in front of that horse, and that failure of judgment was not his alone. Understanding the decision requires sitting with how it felt from inside it. His horse, Boone, was familiar. The route was a few hundred yards across flat ground in the dark. 3 years of accumulated grievance, measured out in tape measure increments and county paperwork, has a particular way of making an absurd idea feel proportionate. The night was thick and airless. No relief, no movement, heat holding flat against the ground. Wes had left his front door open to draw air through the screen. The porch light threw a yellow square across the dirt yard. Several of Coulter's friends had followed outside and stood at the edge of the yard near the porch rather than on it, watching. Boone was already pulling against the bit and snorting before they crossed the property line, the horse uneasy as they closed on the porch steps. Coulter kicked him forward. The horse surged a half step and then stopped violently at the porch threshold beneath the overhanging roof structure, head dropping and hindquarters bracing as it instinctively refused the confined space. The impact occurred when Boone's forehead struck the low porch header beam directly above the entryway. Boone stood roughly 5.5 feet at the withers, and with Coulter already pitched forward over the horse's neck, the sudden full stop caused his upper body to be driven forward and slightly upward into the beam rather than simply folding down. Witnesses standing in the yard near the edge of the porch light described a single, sharp crack, dry and immediate, that cut across the yard before anyone registered what they were seeing. The force of the impact snapped Coulter backward off the saddle. He landed headfirst on the concrete step directly below the entryway. Blood began pooling beneath his head within seconds. Boone shifted back, then backed off the porch entirely into the yard, unharmed and still untied. Wes's wife called emergency services from inside. Wes knelt beside Coulter and tried to keep him still while they waited. Paramedics arrived, and he was transported and died at the hospital later that night. The county medical examiner recorded the cause of death as closed traumatic brain injury. Blood alcohol concentration was documented at 0.19. The manner of death was ruled accidental. The property line is still where it was. Wes Pritchard still lives in that house. Locals passed the story around for weeks as the one about the cowboy who tried to ride indoors, which is accurate as far as it goes, but says nothing about what it looked like for the people standing in that yard when it happened. Personally, I keep returning to the group in the gravel lot. You can rule it accidental and even stupid, but the part where everyone just watched, I'm not sure that holds. Well, at least Coulter had decades of bad decisions behind him. This next guy was 17 years old, and all it took was one dare and the wrong person refusing to back down. It was June 14, 2017, behind a strip of unused farmland in Madhubani district, Bihar, India, where a concrete latrine pit had been sitting in slow deterioration for longer than most adults in the area could clearly remember. The monsoon had softened the ground to mud. The flies were already thick by mid-morning. Sanjeev Batra was 17, and people said that he was the loudest presence in any space he entered. Sanjeev occupied himself the way boys his age did when adult life hadn't claimed them yet, circling other boys, testing edges, making himself the center of whatever was happening. Neighbors had complained to his parents enough times that both had stopped fully engaging with the complaints. He had a particular habit of targeting quieter boys with low-grade public humiliation until they either pushed back or walked away. The dare emerged the way most dares do among teenage boys, sideways, almost as a joke, someone reading the social temperature before committing to it. Sanjeev had spent most of the afternoon mocking a friend, pushing past the point where the friend could absorb it quietly. Someone said the obvious thing, and the septic pit was 30 feet away. The monsoon had been working on the pit for weeks. The surface crust had softened considerably. Sanjeev climbed onto the concrete rim with several boys watching. He slipped off his sandals, the deliberateness of it, the performance of being unbothered, and jumped into the feces waste. He sank immediately to mid-thigh depth into unstable, semi-liquid waste and rain-diluted sludge, accumulated over what investigators later estimated at several years of unmanaged use. There was no solid footing beneath him, only collapsing pockets of softened material that shifted under his weight. Witnesses above described a wet, heavy impact sound followed by his voice, cursing, then demanding a rope. The laughter from the rim was immediate and loud enough that the boys filming could barely hold their phones steady, though it began to fade as his struggle became visible and less controlled. What none of them saw until he was already out was the wound, a section of rusted metal, part of a broken structural bracket from the pit's original concrete construction, had driven into his lower left calf when he landed. A second foot had scraped hard against fractured concrete along the pit wall. He pulled himself out using the bucket rope, covered entirely in waste material, and vomited several times on the ground while the boys around him were still laughing. For 2 days, he treated it the way he treated most things, by refusing to acknowledge it was serious. The cuts on his shins were already there from farm work. This registered as more of the same. By the 3rd day, the tissue around the puncture had swollen visibly, reddening outward in a pattern extending several inches from the entry point. His parents attributed the fever and vomiting to food poisoning and did not examine the wound closely because he always had wounds, and they always turned out fine. On the 5th day, he collapsed near the family courtyard. His uncle transported him by motorcycle to the nearest rural clinic. By that point, the infection had progressed well beyond what the clinic's available resources could address. He died the following morning. Clinical documentation listed the cause of death as septicemia, secondary to an infected puncture wound with significantly delayed presentation, meaning the bacteria from the waste material had entered through the open cuts, spread through his bloodstream over 5 days, and shut his organs down before anyone had treated it as an emergency. His death became the kind of story parents in nearby villages repeated when boys started daring each other toward something dangerous. Not as a tribute, just as a warning delivered in passing. I think that's probably the saddest version of being remembered that there is. This next story is so unbelievable, it took me a second to even believe it was real. A woman spent the entire movie arguing with staff about a seat, and it turned out to be the last argument she ever had. It was November 9th, 2018, in a luxury multiplex cinema in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, during a late Friday screening. By the time the credits rolled, something in the back row had gone very wrong. Denise Mayberry was 46 and worked part-time at a tax preparation office on Birmingham's East Side. She had a documented habit of escalating minor inconveniences into formal disputes, and local retail managers reportedly recognized her name before her face. I love that even retail workers dreaded this woman. Clearly, she turned buying milk into a federal case. In recent months, she had become fixated on the new downtown multiplex, framing it to co-workers as a marker of taste. That Friday, she arrived alone for the 9:45 p.m. showing, carrying 2 bags, a large drink, and outside food. She had reserved a specific recliner and argued at the counter when it was already taken by a confirmed booking. Staff offered other seats, but she pointed to another recliner they had already flagged for a mechanical defect in the powered footrest, and told her it was unsafe to use until maintenance checked it. She kept insisting on that exact chair anyway, sat there for several minutes even after being refused, and only moved when another staff member forced her to relocate to the last available recliner in the back row. However, other guests said that when the staff left and the screening started, she walked back to the same faulty recliner. Now, based on investigations, at some point during the second act, her phone slid off her lap and dropped into the gap between the seat cushion and the retracted footrest linkage housing, a confined mechanical space beneath the front edge of the recliner assembly. The exact moment was entirely unverifiable, but 2 adjacent guests confirmed they noticed her shifting and leaning forward before she became partially obscured below the seat line. The auditorium was dim except for the screen, which was mid-sequence in a chase scene with sustained, loud audio. The air carried popcorn and something synthetic from the ventilation system. Nobody in that direction was watching. She leaned down along the right side of the seat and reached under the front edge of the recliner. At some point, investigators believe she shifted her weight forward while bracing against the powered footrest controls, which have limited resistance and safety cutoff thresholds. Her arm became wedged deeper into the mechanical space. The same recliner staff had warned her about earlier now became the exact problem they had tried to prevent. Instead of pulling out, she went full send into the mechanism. I've seen smarter moves from a hamster on a wheel. Rather than repositioning, she leaned further over the seat edge, bringing her upper torso partially across the recliner frame in an attempt to reach further underneath. Her chest and shoulder became partially compressed between the seat base and the raised structural housing of the footrest assembly, and her neck bent forward at an unsafe angle against the rigid frame. The man 2 seats to her left later told investigators he heard what he described as a muffled, repetitive sound and assumed it was part of the film. He did not look over. The woman directly to her right had fully reclined and was facing the screen. Nobody in the row looked toward her. Her position restricted chest expansion. The forward flexion of her neck combined with upper body compression against the seat structure resulted in reduced airflow and impaired circulation, consistent with positional asphyxia. She had no leverage to push upward from where she had folded into the mechanism. No one checked on her. The film ran for another 41 minutes. When the lights came up, she was still folded into the seat assembly. A cleanup worker found her approximately 19 minutes after the screening ended and then located a manager. First responders arrived in 7 minutes, but the responding paramedic estimated she had likely been dead considerably longer. No prior medical condition was identified as a contributing factor. The theater issued no public statement. The story ran once in a local news segment and did not circulate beyond it. The seat was returned to service within the week. Overall, I think this entire incident is a beautiful lesson in how petty arrogance and a dropped phone can turn a middle-aged woman into human origami. And speaking of petty, this next guy was already saved from a disaster and decides to risk it all again for a toy. It was February 11th, 2016, in a low-rise residential block in Osaka, Japan, when a fire that started just after midnight left one person toasted. Not because the building surprised him, but because he walked back into it after it had already let him go. Takumi Sera was 44 years old and worked rotating warehouse shifts at a regional distribution facility on the city's east side. He had lived in the same second-floor unit for 11 years. Most of his discretionary income went toward a collection of boxed anime figurines, older releases from Naruto, a long-running ninja-themed series, stacked and cataloged with a precision he applied to little else. Apparently, the fire originated from an electrical wiring fault in the wall cavity from a kitchen. By the time alarms sounded, smoke was moving through the ceiling void and into the stairwell above the second floor, spreading laterally through concealed gaps in the structure. Residents evacuated quickly. Takumi came down with everyone else, coughing, jacket over his undershirt, apartment keys in hand. He was on the pavement when crews arrived. The man made it out alive, safe and sound. The story's over, right? Well, residents gathered in coats against the far wall. Takumi stood among them for under 2 minutes before he began describing a limited edition figurine still upstairs. One he said was worth more than half his neighbor's monthly rent. People around him said to leave it. A firefighter moved to the entrance, physically stepped between him and the doorway, and used a hand signal while ordering him to stay back, warning the stairwell was compromised. Takumi continued arguing. Then, while crews repositioned equipment around the far side of the building, he moved past the entrance and went in. Aya, standing roughly 15 feet away, later told investigators she watched him push through the smoke still holding his apartment keys. She called after him. He did not stop. Less than a minute after he entered, after structural conditions that had been weakening for several minutes due to heat buildup in the ceiling void, the upper floor gave way. Witnesses described a single compressive crash. Not an explosion, just a flat, heavy structural drop lasting about 3 seconds, followed by a dense column of gray dust forcing through the doorframe and into the street. The building went quieter than it had been since the alarms first started. Firefighters attempted entry immediately, but were pushed back by heat and debris. The entrance was already partially obstructed by shifting interior collapse material, and crews had to wait for stabilization before re-entry. It took 41 minutes before they reached his unit. They found Takumi near the doorway, pinned under collapsed ceiling beams, plaster, and thermal debris. He wasn't even close to his room. The medical examiner determined the cause of death to be blunt crush trauma to the thorax and skull consistent with structural collapse, with contributing smoke inhalation. A small exterior security camera mounted above the building entrance recorded portions of the evacuation and later fireground activity, though it was not widely reviewed outside the initial investigation. The fire received one short article in a local newspaper. It did not generate lasting coverage. What the neighborhood discussed for weeks afterward was not the fire or the wiring, it was the figurine. I've written a lot of these cases, and this one doesn't produce grief so much as a specific, quiet frustration. Every person on that pavement already knew the outcome when he walked back in. They said so out loud. A firefighter physically blocked the entrance and told him directly. He went anyway, and the building did exactly what everyone said it would. All right, this next one genuinely gets under my skin, because it wasn't a split-second panic or a bad decision made in 5 seconds. This was a habit. It was September 17, 2013, at a private waste transfer station on the industrial edge of Newark, New Jersey, where the air carried diesel exhaust, and the machinery ran loud enough that workers communicated mostly through hand signals. A string of heavy construction loads had pushed the facility behind schedule, and the tension on the floor had been building since the morning handoff. Brenda Kessick was 39 and had worked at the facility for 9 years, longer than most of her current crew. She was a shift supervisor known for pushing people hard, but also for knowing the line operations inside and out better than almost anyone on site. Her relationship with safety protocols was complicated. She didn't ignore them outright, but she bent them when she believed experience outweighed procedure, which was often. Management had written her up twice and placed her on a final written warning after disputes over overtime enforcement and equipment handling instructions. She took each write-up without argument, signed what she needed to sign, and went back to work the same way she always had. The debris load jamming the rear compactor that afternoon was not unusual. Splintered plywood, fractured drywall, and broken cabinet frames stacked unevenly inside a partially cycled bin. Pressure sensors flagged an imbalance and triggered an alarm with an interlock maintenance shutdown hold. The system allowed a manual override that had not been properly secured. Brenda arrived, assessed in roughly 15 seconds, and climbed the side ladder rather than call it in. Her reasoning was likely consistent with her pattern: redistribute the load or fall further behind schedule. When I first read through this one, my reaction wasn't sympathy. It was something closer to exhaustion. 9 years of warnings, and not one of them changed anything. A younger employee, Nico Salas, was standing approximately 12 feet away when Brenda swung herself into the chamber. He told investigators he had seen her do this before and told her directly that the warning indicator was still active. She kicked debris toward the steel ram and kept working. The compactor had been left in automatic cycle mode. Nobody had disabled it. Nico described standing there watching her redistribute debris with her boots, waiting for her to step back and climb out, aware something was wrong and no longer certain how to make her stop. The compactor registered the corrected pressure balance and resumed its hydraulic sequence. Witnesses heard the deep mechanical engagement, the same sound at the start of every cycle, followed immediately by a single scream from inside the bin. The steel ram descended. In a split second, she had time to look up and attempt to move backward, but the interior gave her less than 2 feet of lateral space. Compression registered within seconds, and the force exceeded several thousand psi. Bones fractured within the first moments of contact. Nico hit the emergency stop. Another worker cut the main line. Neither reversed what had already happened. Nico called 911, and emergency and fire crews arrived in 8 minutes. Extraction of the body from the unit took over an hour due to the machinery's design. The coroner's findings described severe crush trauma to the thorax and abdomen, bilateral rib fractures with pulmonary involvement, pelvic fracture, and injuries consistent with high-force mechanical compression. Death occurred before extraction was complete. Authorities cited multiple violations, noting that every posted safety requirement beside the unit had been bypassed. I don't think Brenda deserved to die the way she did. Nobody does. But I also can't pretend the warnings weren't there. From coworkers, from management, from the machine itself. At the facility, conversations in the weeks that followed were quiet and uncomfortable, not because her death was unexpected, but because it wasn't, and that was the part nobody knew how to say. Our last story features a woman who turned a grocery run into a fashion statement, and it was the one accessory she refused to take off that killed her. It was March 17, 2018, in a surface parking lot on the northern edge of Southport Gold Coast, Queensland. Not every death announces itself. Some arrive mid-errand, surrounded by people loading groceries, and the only warning is a sound that witnesses spend weeks trying to describe accurately. Marissa Ryan was 47 and recently divorced. She worked part-time as a styling consultant and had spent the past year rebuilding her public identity with the focus most people reserve for recovery. She drove a restored vintage roadster, an open-top two-seater with exposed rear-wheel hardware and wire spokes, and treated every errand as an occasion. The vehicle was the center of an image she defended aggressively. That Saturday, she arrived in oversized sunglasses, heeled sandals, and a long silk scarf wrapped around her neck, the trailing end nearly at her knees. A store clerk later told investigators she had commented on it herself, said it was meant to look like something from another era. She had spent so long building this version of herself that any concession to practicality would have felt like a public retreat. The decision was entirely consistent with everything she had already committed to. The wind along that section of the lot was running between 12 and 18 miles per hour, enough to keep the storefront banners extended. The lot sat open on three sides with no windbreak. As she moved toward the exit lane at low speed, both ends of the scarf were already active behind her. The rear wheel assembly on that model sits partially exposed below the body panel, a design detail original to the build and preserved in the restoration. Hannah Marquez was walking with her young son, roughly 30 feet from the exit lane. She told investigators the first thing she registered was not visual. It was a short, compressed gagging sound, less than a second long, followed immediately by the scrape of tires against the concrete curb edge. By the time she turned, the car was in the final moments of braking. The scarf had already been drawn into the rotating rear wheel assembly, caught during forward motion before the vehicle reached a stop. As braking force increased, the remaining wheel rotation and vehicle deceleration created a sudden tightening pull. Marissa was pressed hard against the headrest, her neck wrenched sharply to the right. Her sunglasses were on the pavement. The wheel had stopped only after the entanglement fully arrested the remaining rotation. The fabric had not. Several bystanders reached the driver's side within seconds. The scarf could not be loosened by hand. The tension was total. One bystander attempted to reach the fabric near the wheel and could not free it without tools. There was no movement from the driver. I've gone through a lot of accident accounts, and I think what's hardest about this one is how many people were close enough and how little that proximity mattered. Hannah called emergency services from the scene, but paramedics could only pronounce Marissa dead at the scene. The coroner identified the cause of death as mechanical strangulation with acute cervical fracture at the third and fourth vertebrae, occurring during sudden high-tension deceleration, consistent with a rapid lateral traction force applied while the vehicle was braking. There was no survivable interval. The mechanism did exactly what the physics required. The parking attendant was removed from duty pending review and quietly reinstated. I feel for the attendant here more than anything. From my perspective, it's hard to see how one person could realistically anticipate every edge case in a space that complex, and I think they were unfairly left carrying the weight of something that was ultimately a chain of design, behavior, and environment all colliding at once.